Okay, this is a 20-minute or so presentation about the hawthorn tree and its role in the Ogham Grove. Now, before I talk about the hawthorn on its own, I want to go back a little bit and look at the four quarters of the Ogham Grove. The individual quarters are four groups of five, and we've just finished the first quarter. The first five trees are a set or a group in their own, and hawthorn, the tree of today, is the beginning of a new quarter of the wheel. Now, the simple way of looking at the year is what's called the sun cross. So this is the four stations of the sun, with the yew tree at winter solstice, and then the ash tree at spring equinox, and then the apple tree summer solstice, and the elder tree autumn equinox. So the first group of five, although the first tree is the birch tree is kind of like 1 o'clock on the clock's face, if you like. So the winter solstice is the 0 point. For us, we like saying midnight, 0, 0, double dot, 0, 0. So after midnight, you come to 1 o'clock, and that's the birch tree. So the first group or Aicme of the Ogham is these five: birch tree, rowan, alder tree, willow, and then ash tree. So what kind of happens is each quarter begins at a 0 point of the previous Aicme, and each quarter holds in its center a fire festival. So the first group holds Imbolc, the fire festival sacred to Brigid and Bridie, Brigantia, and so on. So one way of looking at it, and I am going to do, I said I would, I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to do a small presentation for YouTube just about the four Aicme and how they kind of function. But one way of looking at it is that the first Aicme really holds the moment of Imbolc, and it concludes with the spring equinox. And they all do that then. So the next Aicme, the one we're looking at today, is going to be hawthorn, but the whole hawthorn, it's known as the Aicme Uatha, the H group, but it's the quarter that is named after hawthorn, just like the first quarter is named after Beeth. So the birch quarter holds Imbolc, and the hawthorn quarter holds Beltane. And if the overall flavor or feeling of the first quarter was Imbolc and Brigid, Brigantia, but also then holding the cauldron of Annuin lore and the 9 maidens, it was all to do really with the fires of creativity, the fires of inspiration, and the fires of poetry. One of the main things of Bridie as a triple goddess is goddess of poetry. So remember, this is all coming from a bardic tradition anyway, so the poetic inspiration and the cauldron. So the general flavor then of the first quarter was Bridie, Imbolc, cauldron of inspiration, and so on, leading you up to spring equinox. So now then we're into a brand new quarter. And this quarter in many ways began at spring equinox, because spring equinox would have been the 0 moment before going to 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. And the curious thing is, and this came up in the Facebook group a while ago, the five Aicme in this group, hawthorn, oak, holly, hazel, and apple. In Gaelic, their letters H, D, T, C, and Q are the first letters of the Irish numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's a really enigmatic thing. And we looked into it a little bit, and it's not just Irish 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It goes way, way back to Proto-Indo-European languages, that H, D, T, C, Q are how you pronounce 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in various dialects of Celtic and pre-Celtic languages. So this led some people to thinking that the Ogham should begin with Hawthorn, because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So logically, you begin with number 1 tree and then go to number 2 tree. But the Irish mythology is that it begins with birch, that the first Ogham inscription was birch times 7, 7 letter B's scratched into wood. So that was beginning at winter solstice. And a curious thing too is that in Ireland, there were 5 sacred trees, extra special sacred trees, and 3 of them were ash trees. So 3 of them were the spring equinox, and the other 2 were the yew tree, the winter solstice. So of all the trees that are in the Ogham, it was the tree of spring equinox and the tree of winter solstice that were the 5 sacred trees in Ireland. So why? I would guess one way of looking at the wheel is to follow the sun going through the year, in which case winter solstice is the rebirth of the sun. So that's a natural starting point after the winter solstice. However, many ancient cultures began their new year with the spring equinox as well. So there's different ways of doing it. And really the spring equinox it's not the rebirth of the sun, because that's winter solstice, but spring equinox in many cultures was the beginning of the agricultural year. You know, the first planting of seeds and all of that sort of stuff. So there's a logic to Hawthorn being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 if you're following a agricultural year, and also the spring equinox is the beginning of the zodiacal year. So that could be one way of observing it too. You know, it's the Aries, the ram-headed serpent motif sort of thing. So following the things we learned recently over since the winter solstice, you know, looking at birch, rowan and alder and willow and ash and the patterns they play, there did seem to be some sort of overall theme that, going through it very quickly in my memory, the winter solstice is the rebirth of the sun, followed by birch, which theoretically relates best to the goddess Ellen, and Ellen literally means a ray of sunlight. So you have the rebirth of the sun, and then the first tree is this ray of sunlight correspondences. And then the tree that follows is the rowan, which is Bridie Brigid Brigantia, and her main symbol is a flame. It's a creative fire, eternal flame. And like her eternal flame being kept at Kildare and stuff. So there's winter solstice, rebirth of the sun, there's birch tree and its ray of sunlight lore. And then the ray of sunlight is followed by a tree that's an eternal living flame, the rowan, and that takes you into Imbolc, which is the main festival of Bridie Brigid Brigantia. And then the following tree, the second herald of Imbolc, was the alder tree, and that has the lore of the shield, but also the cauldron of Annwn, and it corresponds with opposite zodiacal stuff in the sign of Leo Virgo. And then it's followed by the willow tree, which is the 9 maidens or the 9 muses of inspiration. And they keep, according to poetry related to Taliesin, the breath or spirit of the 9 maidens keeps the cauldron of Annuin warm, keeps it cooking. And it's the cauldron of inspiration. So again, it's back to Brigid being the goddess of poetry and creative fire inspiration, and the cauldron's cooking that. And then that all concludes, all of that kind of rebirth of the sun, first ray of sunlight, creative fire, quickening the cauldron, concludes with the ash tree at the spring equinox. And from that moment onwards, the days are longer than the nights. So you've kind of had all this sunshine, fiery imagery leading to the spring equinox. So what do we take from that, and how does that apply to this next Aicme? So I don't know yet. Look, I'm still learning as we go along, but if it's something similar, that there's spring equinox being the 0 moment of what happens with, and then Hawthorn would be like the birch tree in that position. And then it's the essence of Hawthorn that leads to Beltane and the oak and the holly. And I'm going to come to that shortly. I'm just kind of looking at the general pattern of a group of 5. So we had the first pattern of the first group of 5, and what patterns are there in the next group. So it is going to be Hawthorn, and that whole group holds Beltane, and it will conclude with apple tree at summer solstice. So that's kind of what we're looking at with this second quarter of the Ogham, the Aicme Uatha. Now, looking at the ash tree as the 0 point for this quarter of the wheel, the main figurehead for that was Lu, the young hero. At spring equinox, very much he had arrived, he had risen, this divine youth that can defeat all darkness. You know, he represents the triumph of light over darkness. Now, jumping ahead a little bit, I would suggest that one of the patterns with this group is that it's about him, the young god, proving himself or winning the hand of the May Queen. And I think that's played out in lots of different ways. But Lu himself is represented in different stories by different characters. They're all variants of the same theme. Now, Hawthorne then, most commonly, I guess, in English folklore, is the May Queen. Now, the May Queen doesn't really belong to any mythology as such. You're not going to find, in brackets, the May Queen in the Mabinogion, for instance. You know, she's the queen of the May, and she's the, what would you call it, the Maid Marian or the Guinevere or the love interest of the Oak King and the Holly King battling at Beltane with all the rites of May. And I'm going to go into that a bit deeper shortly. But the actual phrase May Queen isn't old Brythonic, old Welsh or anything. However, there are plenty of, what would you call them, flower goddesses or spring goddesses, or just sovereignty goddesses, really, you know, representing the divine feminine of the land that various heroes then fight for. A famous one in Glastonbury, there's a plane going overhead. Famous one in Glastonbury is a goddess called Crediliath, and she's the heart's desire of Gwyn ap Neath, and he has a battle every May Day against a character called Gwythyr at Greidel, and they fight every May Day until the day of doom, and the winner will win her hand, kind of thing. But it's a repeated pattern of this: two lovers, two males fighting at Beltane to win the love of the goddess of flowers or the goddess of the land or what have you. Now, that's played out in different ways. Probably the most interesting one relating to Hawthorne itself is a story from the Mabinogion, and it's a story called How Killuch won Olwen. I don't know how to pronounce it, and it could be North Welsh dialect or Southern Welsh dialect, but Killuch. He's a typical Lugh. He's a young hero that falls in love with a beautiful young sovereignty goddess called Olwen, and he wants to marry her. But before he can marry her, he has to ask her father's permission. And that's where it's all very, very difficult, because her father is a giant and his name is wonderful. His name is Ysbyddaden Pengower, which translates as Hawthorne, the chief of giants. And he's like some great big, massive, spiky, gigantic ogre of a character. And the thing is he knows that the day that his daughter marries, he himself will die. And so he's not very keen to let the young hero have his daughter's hand in marriage, for obvious reasons. But this is a recurring motif too. So sometimes when you have two males fighting at Beltane, like Oak King, Holly King, one can represent the summer, one can represent the winter, fighting for the spirit goddess of the land. But sometimes in the stories, it's an old king being usurped by a young king, or there's other roles, you know, like say winter and summer, old and young, or this world and the other world. So it can be a battle between a mortal king against an immortal king, something otherworldly and fey, like Gawain and the Green Knight, that kind of thing. Anyway, the young hero, Killuch, is persistent, and Ysbyddaden, the giant, says, okay, you can have my daughter if you achieve this long list of things I'm going to ask you to achieve. And here's the thing, that there is a long list of impossible tasks for him to achieve, but full of the confidence of youth. At every task he's given, he's like, yeah, I can do that, and it won't be difficult, you know, and it goes on and on and on, and yeah, I can do that, it won't be difficult. He has every intention of going to King Arthur, who is his uncle or his cousin, and asking King Arthur and all of his men to help him achieve these impossible things. And what's really interesting, and it's going to take, there isn't time here in this talk to explain it, but all of the difficult, impossible tasks, at least 6 of them represent constellations in the night sky and star law patterns. For instance, a common one that a lot of us are familiar with now is the stars of the summertime are the 3 birds known as the summer triangle, which is Cygnus the swan, Aquila the eagle, and Lyra the harp, was often portrayed as a small bird. So these 3 birds are the summer triangle, and in southern Welsh mythology, they're the birds of Rhiannon, you know, and they're depicted on the Gunderstrup cauldron as well. So one of the impossible tasks that the Hawthorne, the chief of giants, wants is he wants the birds of Rhiannon to sing for him at supper time. or at the wedding feast and stuff, you know. And also they have to hunt this ferocious boar, and it's impossible to hunt this boar without the help of Gwyn ap Neath. Now, Gwyn ap Neath is the constellation that we call Orion the hunter, and his hunting hound, Sirius, is Dormoth. And more than likely in the sky, Orion is hunting Taurus the bull, and I suggest that Taurus the bull is probably the boar that the winter hunter is hunting. But again, it's an impossible task. But step back a bit and think about that. Now, Killuch goes to King Arthur, tells him his dilemma and that he needs help achieving these impossible tasks. And it's quite difficult to read, because in the Mabinogion, the young hero then lists every single one of the warriors in Arthur's entourage. And there's 200 of them. And he's naming them individually. And some of them have got special characteristics, you know, and Taliesin's amongst them, and other characters. So he's invoking 200 heroes of Arthur's court to help him achieve these impossible tasks. And the rest of the story accounts for most of them. There's a lot missing, because it is a happy ever after. The young hero does achieve all of the impossible tasks, and Uspathaden the giant is defeated and killed, and Killuch, the young Lugh, gets his bride, you know. But certainly the story is garbled and lots of bits are missing. But now here's a thing. If these impossible tasks around the night sky are star lore stories, like little adventures making one big adventure, and it's beginning with a zodiac year at Aries at the spring equinox, you know, so you have the spring equinox, beginning of a new agricultural year or zodiac year, and here's a quest around the stars. Now, here's a few enigmatic things. Now, this was already known in the classical world. Hercules famously had 12 labors, and the 12 labors of Hercules are acknowledged as being 12 impossible tasks that he manages to achieve around the zodiac, you know. And here's the thing, King Arthur, when he's very first mentioned in the archives, in the writings accredited to a man called Nennius, he describes Arthur as having 12 battles. You know, so a lot of people try and figure out where the geographical locations are for these 12 battles, and there's so many theories and arguments about where they may have happened, but equally they might not be geographical. You know, the 12 battles of Arthur could be in the heavens, just like getting the 3 birds of Rhiannon or Gwyn ap Neath and so on. And what's really interesting too is in the story of how Killuch won Olwen, here and there, Arthur says, you know, they've still got some impossible tasks to achieve. And the words in the translation are King Arthur saying, which of these wonders shall we do next? You know, what's the next wonder we're going to achieve? And so that implication of wonder is so similar to Hercules and his 12 labors, and Arthur with his 12 battles saying, what wonder are we going to do next? You know, these are impossible metaphysical things. Now then, mustn't forget Flora. Hercules, the zodiac god of 12 labors, had a sexual companion. She wasn't married to him, they were just companions, lovers, or whatever, and that's the goddess Flora. Now, what I'm about to say is contentious for some people, because, and it's understandable, a lot of people come to the kind of Celtic mythology looking from a druidic sympathy or empathy, and there's a natural resistance to anything Roman. The Romans are the bad guys, of course, you know. However, there are different groups of Celts. You know, the Irish Celts are known as Goidelic or Goidelic, but the Britons Celts, the Brythonic Celts, they were Romanized for 4 centuries, you know, and it can't be undone. So when we're looking at Dark Age culture, or even the medieval culture of the Mabinogion, you know, the Mabinogion follows on from Romano-Celtic culture. The only Britons that weren't Romanized were the furthest northern ones, the Picts. They were Britons as well, they just weren't Romanized. And the curious thing, in South Wales, for instance, there's pillar stones with that are bilingual, that they're bilingual because they've got Ogham inscriptions on them and Latin inscriptions on them. The southern Welsh had Ogham and Latin because they were Romanized. Now, and that's in the Mabinogion too, you know, the dream of Maxen Wledig is all about the Roman emperor building Roman towns for the goddess Ellen in Wales. Caerleon, Caermarthen, Caernarfon were Roman centers built for the goddess of the land, you know, this kind of Roman marriage to the sovereignty goddess kind of thing. Now, in the Mabinogion, there's various flower goddesses, like Olwen. Her name means white tracks, little white flowers. And famously, there's Blodeuwedd, the summer goddess made of oak, broom, and meadowsweet by the god Gwythian. So there's a recurring pattern, spring maidens, flower goddesses. Now, the Roman influence can't be ignored. And there was a very, very, very important goddess to the Romans called Flora. And she was the, like I said, the lover companion of Hercules, the zodiac god. Now, Flora had her own festival, and she's the goddess of flowers, of course, that's what her name means. And her festival is really interesting because her festival, the Floralia, happened every year between the 28th of April and the 3rd of May. You know, so the festival of the goddess of flowers was Beltane, really, 28th of April to the 3rd of May. And for those days, it was incredibly licentious and sexual, and lots of theatre with nudity and yeah, sex on stage and all of that kind of thing. The early church frowned on it and put a stop to it very, very quickly, you know. But it was about literally the rites of May and the fertility of the land and so on. And for a more kind of profound or Venus perspective, Flora also had a very special sacred day later in the month, and that wasn't licentious. It was much more, like I say, profound, and that was on the 23rd of May, and it was just a sacred day of the rose queen, the rose goddess, you know. So on the one hand, the Floralia festival around Beltane was this flower goddess, May Queen, of which one can imagine that there would have been various consorts lusting after her or trying to win her or whatever, you know, and so that finds its way through the centuries of English culture to maypole dancing and Morris men and all the rest of it, you know. But this celebration of the Beltane period goes way, way back to Roman times, which predates the Mabinogion stories by at least 800 years, you know. So it's worth acknowledging that for nearly 400 years, the Romanized Britons heard about this flower goddess every Beltane, you know, so it can't be ignored. Anyway, we're finished there. So I'll stop recording and you can put your microphones back on.